Welcome everyone. Today we're diving into the intricate world of psychological trauma in legal practice, exploring how vicarious trauma, burnout, and compassion fatigue shape the lives of lawyers and even judges.
Absolutely, it's a fascinating yet challenging subject. And the depth of data really surprises me.
Yes, exactly.
Especially when you consider the personal and systemic factors at play.
Right. You know, the chapter we're discussing really lays it all out. From the causes like high caseloads, billing pressures, and an unsupportive workplace culture, to personal risk factors such as age, gender, personality, and even unresolved trauma from earlier experiences.
And what really stands out to me is how these factors, especially the systemic ones, put lawyers at risk almost from the moment they leave law school. I mean, they're expected to be stoic and detached, even when working with deeply distressing content.
Exactly. And that expectation of emotional detachment creates a sort of double bind. Lawyers are trained to suppress their emotions, and that leads to a kind of internal crisis once those traumatic exposures start piling up.
And there's that whole issue with legal culture, isn't there? The pressure to meet billing targets, the constant competition, and a workplace that not only discourages self-care, but often actually punishes vulnerability.
Yes, and what's really striking is the way this culture exacerbates burnout. The signs are clearly laid out: exhaustion, cynicism, and diminished efficacy. It's almost as if, despite their intelligence and training, lawyers often end up, well, underperforming because the system is rigged against them.
Yeah, it's counterintuitive, isn't it? The very qualities that make a good lawyer, rationality, objectivity, can sometimes alienate them from addressing their own well-being.
Definitely. And then there's compassion fatigue, which seems to be another insidious factor here. While compassion fatigue emerges from that deep emotional engagement with clients' suffering, it's not necessarily about being too compassionate, but more about overextending oneself emotionally, especially for those new to traumatic cases.
I get that. Exactly. Many young lawyers can experience what they call a rescue mentality. They take on clients' pain expecting to make a difference, but eventually the cumulative stress of not seeing favorable outcomes or facing systemic flaws starts to wear them down.
And when we talk about secondary trauma stress, the scenario worsens. Lawyers are not only affected by the experiences of their clients, but also by the graphic evidence and detailed accounts of traumatic events they have to deal with day in and day out.
Right. And that exposure can trigger all sorts of PTSD-like symptoms: intrusive thoughts, hypervigilance, reduced concentration, all of which diminish a lawyer's ability to function optimally in their high-stakes environment.
You know, one thing that really caught my attention is how these issues aren't isolated to lawyers alone. Judges and even jurors, who we usually think of as more detached, are also suffering from secondary trauma, especially considering the heavy implications for their decision-making under stress.
Precisely. The chapter even details how, for judges, working in isolation and facing intense personal scrutiny while handling traumatic content can lead to severe stress and even result in reliance on alcohol.
And jurors, often randomly selected and unprepared for chilling trial evidence, face a similar risk. Imagine being thrust into a trial that's laden with graphic, violent testimonies without any debriefing afterward.
It's almost like the whole system neglects the mental well-being of everyone involved in the legal process.
Right, and speaking of system-level issues, the chapter really emphasizes the failure of traditional legal education to even introduce trauma theory. It essentially sets up lawyers to be, well, ill-equipped emotionally from the start.
Yeah, and that lack of early training in handling emotional stress, compounded with the stigma around discussing mental health in law, really creates a vicious cycle.
Exactly. And add to that the workplace bullying and discrimination that many lawyers face. The literature is pretty damning on how widespread bullying is, contributing further to burnout and even vicarious trauma.
Right, that elephant in the room
which
factor.
Often goes unreported because of fear of damaging one's reputation.
And it's interesting how gender plays into this too. The text shows that while female lawyers are more likely to seek help, they also face more discrimination and harassment, which only adds another layer to their trauma exposure.
Yes, women not only bear the brunt of the emotional impact, but additional burdens from, say, sexual harassment and expectations to juggle professional and familial roles. It's like a perfect storm of pressure.
And even though women make a majority in many jurisdictions now, the so-called glass ceiling persists, further isolating those who actually need support.
Now, turning to coping mechanisms, what struck me was how many lawyers tend to use avoidant coping strategies like overworking, or even relying on alcohol and drugs as temporary fixes.
Yeah,
It creates a
those strategies only
self-perpetuating
serve to
cycle
delay the
that harms
inevitable
both their
breakdown,
professional
right?
and personal lives.
Exactly. And the data on alcohol use in the legal profession is startling. When nearly a third of lawyers are identified as problem drinkers, it really underscores how the culture isn't supportive of healthy coping habits.
Definitely. And what's more, there are stark differences highlighted between smaller, supportive workplaces and large law-as-business firms where profit dominates all decisions. Those commercial pressures often lead to unsustainable workloads that make self-care nearly impossible, which
Absolutely,
in turn
and it's
impacts
that
client
disconnect
outcomes.
between ethical practice and business metrics that really contributes to burnout. Now, I understand some may argue that lawyers are naturally resilient because they're trained to cope with adversarial situations, but do you really think that's enough?
Well, that's a good point. I respectfully challenge that notion. Resilience isn't an inherent, limitless trait. It can be overwhelmed by systemic pressures and constant traumatic exposure. The data clearly suggests that even with training, many lawyers simply aren't given the right tools or support to manage their vulnerability over time.
Yes, and that's where trauma-informed legal practices come in. The chapter suggests that instead of ignoring these issues, firms need to adopt structural supports, like better supervision, collegial support, and dedicated self-care training to help mitigate the risks.
Exactly. And that's where frameworks like the Vicarious Trauma Toolkit model play a crucial role. It provides practical steps for identifying and managing the early signs of trauma exposure before they evolve into more severe symptoms.
A
which
proactive
makes all
approach
the
rather than
difference.
a reactive one. And it's not just about individual recovery. It's about transforming a toxic culture into one that places well-being at the forefront of professional responsibility.
Right? And there's an urgent call to incorporate trauma theory into legal education. The more lawyers understand the impact of trauma on themselves, their clients, and their colleagues, the better they can manage their practice with compassion and effectiveness.
Absolutely. When lawyers, judges, and even jurors are better prepared psychologically, the entire justice system can work more intelligently and ethically.
And we can't overlook the personal stories and statistics, like those startling figures showing that nearly 3 times the rate of depression among lawyers compared to other professions. These aren't just numbers. They represent real human suffering that, frankly, demands urgent reform.
And what's equally concerning is how stigma perpetuates the problem. Lawyers fear that seeking help will mark them as weak, which only makes it harder for them to access the support they need.
Right. The culture of invincibility might look admirable on paper, but it's downright damaging in practice. Breaking that stigma could not only improve individual well-being, but also enhance professional performance overall, which could even lead
a small
to
shift in
post-traumatic
attitude
growth
could
in some
lead to,
cases.
substantial systemic improvements. And that brings us to the hopeful aspect. While trauma in legal practice is deeply embedded, there are emerging strategies and reforms. Law societies are now offering continuing professional development seminars on trauma-informed legal practice, and more research is pushing for systemic change.
Absolutely. And those initiatives are essential. We need comprehensive approaches that combine organizational reform with personal self-care practices. It's about creating environments where lawyers feel safe to speak up and seek help.
Yes, and while we're still far from perfect, the conversation is shifting. The hope is that one day mental health will be seen as integral to professional excellence, rather than a weakness to hide.
Exactly. And as we wrap up our discussion, it's clear that understanding trauma in legal practice is not just an academic exercise. It's a call to action for transforming the legal profession.
Indeed, a transformation
more
that
humane
benefits not
and
only the
sustainable.
lawyers, but the entire justice system. Well said. It's been an enlightening discussion, and I hope that our insights today inspire concrete steps towards change in the challenging arena of legal practice.